We, the United Methodists in Louisiana, stand against racism. And together, we are focused on learning and growing together as a family. Join us for an important and perhaps ministry-changing set of conversations as we discuss where and how we as a church can respond and have the conversation we so desperately need to have. Together, we'll study topics such as systemic racism, white supremacy, what it means to be white, both in the world and in the church, how to be an anti-racist, and all the while explore ways we as grace-driven people can begin having grace-filled conversations that lead to transformation. We stand in the hope that racism can be rooted out, because we know deep down as Christians that we are made in the image of God and that it should not, cannot, and must not be this way. We know a handful of webinars won't solve the issue of racism overnight, but we also know with intentionality, vulnerability, courage, honesty, and most importantly, the power of the Holy Spirit, we can take that next faithful step and live into a future of hope. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. This is the second of 3 webinars by the Louisiana Conference and our good friends at Project Curate. Welcome. My name is Todd Rossnagel. I'm the Director of Communications for the conference, and we're going to be taking your questions a little bit later. So please submit those via the Q&A that is located down at the bottom of your screen. These webinars are discussions surrounding racial injustice and the work that we are all called to do. And this is Module 2, White Fragility and White Supremacy. Next week at this time, Thursday at 2 p.m., we will bring you Module 3, Blackness and Anti-Blackness 101. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Your mics are muted and your cameras are off. This is a webinar. It's done with the express purpose of being able to focus on the content and keeping the distractions at a minimum. But as I said, we want your questions. This is how our time will be extremely fruitful. So please submit your questions down below. And in today's webinar, we're going to have a little bit more time for Q&A. We're going to, instead of the questions and the answers being at the very end, we're going to have them a little bit more interspersed through our time together, and we'll go over that as we go forward. Our hosts for today's webinar, the same as last week, from Project Curate, a nonprofit that works with religious and community organizations to support collaborative responses to issues of inequality and injustice. And we are so very, very thankful and happy to have their expertise with us. Reverend Dr. Matt Russell, who currently serves as a pastor at Chapelwood United Methodist Church in Houston, Texas. And Dr. Rachel Schneider. Dr. Schneider is a scholar of religion and race and culture, as well as a community social justice advocate herself, based in Houston. And also joining us, we're happy to have Reverend Dr. Mark Boswell. Mark serves as the executive director of the faith-based nonprofit Together for Hope in Lake Providence, Louisiana. Mark is ordained with the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. And finally, Bishop Cynthia Fierro Harvey, who needs no introduction, serves as the bishop for the Louisiana Conference in connection with her Episcopal assignment. She is also president of the Council of Bishops. So with all that done, and let's get to the content, let's get to why we're here. Bishop Harvey, if you could start us off with a word of prayer and an opening word, if you will.
I will. Thank you.
Thank
you for being here again today. I know that schedules are busy and you're going from one thing to another, but this is an important time and a time where even for you to just be present in this conversation is courageous. We were talking before the rest of you came on that these are very hard conversations to have, but your courage just to be present is it gives me hope. Gives me hope for how we might, in fact, engage with one another and see one another for all that God has made us to be and called us to be. So I'm not going to take up any important time that you might have engaging in conversation. Please do use the Q&A and the chat and whatever you need. Your questions are what drives this this webinar. So you actually drive the engagement. So please be sure and add your questions along the way. So let's pray. Most gracious God, for this day we give you thanks and for the privilege that we have to gather around this virtual table and to even begin to have this conversation. Oh God, just guide us in this time. We know that that we sometimes don't even know how to have this conversation. We don't know the right questions to ask, and sometimes we don't ask them in fear of being judged. But we know that when we do engage with one another, when we see each other for all that God has called us to be, that somehow you use all of that for good. So use us in this time. We're yours. We are your vessels. We are ready to receive all that you can pour into us during this time that we are together. So I just ask you again, guide our conversations. May they be fruitful, and may they indeed honor you and honor all that you have called us to be. For this we give thanks and praise. Amen. Amen.
I just wanted to welcome everyone again to this webinar, and also just to express our gratitude for the chance just to be in dialogue, to be working these things out with y'all, to be talking about these things at this time. I want to share, if Todd, if you'll put up the first slide, I just wanted to kind of share the flow of where we're going this session. I don't know if you can, maybe the second slide. That's the, we'll go to the second side of that. Where at the beginning, I'll just kind of give some opening introductory framing of some of what we're doing and some of the work that's ahead of us. We'll talk about white supremacy and white fragility as well. What are those concepts? How do we get our hands, our brains around them? How do they work themselves out in our culture, in our own lives? How do we build resilience then? In terms of working and in terms of kind of sitting with these concepts and these realities, and then kind of moving forward, how do we build resilience in these aspects? And then at the end, we'll shift the focus to our imaginations. What role does our imaginations have in helping us to understand the kingdom of God, the call of these things in our lives, and how to shift? And so, and throughout, as Todd had said, after each section, we're just going to open it up for question and answer time. And so if you have a question, please use, as Todd said, the question and answer button. You can, I think there's also a way to do that anonymously too. And so you can post your questions, and we'll open it up for some more dialogue today. So thanks for sharing that, Todd. We can go back to the full screen now. I think that firstly, what I want to do and kind of underline what Bishop Harvey has said is continue to acknowledge the difficult work that this is for us as people, as a white community, as a church. Particularly for those of us who are coming to understand the complicated history that power and money, access, whiteness, and oppression have and continue to have. These realities are multi-layered, and so it takes a long time to sift through, to work out, to understand. And there's sometimes this feeling, particularly in the I think in the moment that we're in, for some folks for whom these concepts are new, there feels like that we're way behind the times, and there's just a ton of catch up, and there's this like anger that's happening and all those things. And so I want to kind of acknowledge that, because there's historical strands that are woven through all of this. There's our own denominational strands, economic strands, our own family and familial strands, spiritual strands, psychological strands, more, I'm sure, that are all woven together to how we understand this moment, how we got to this moment, understand race and privilege, our history as Americans, who benefits the claim of the gospel amid it all, and to continue to hold out this deep ethic of equity and mutuality, not just as an idea, not just as a spiritual concept, but as something that as pastors, as lay folks, as churches, we work towards. We really work towards that prayer, let your kingdom come on earth. And so we're working towards that, not just, as we've said before, it's not just an evacuation plan out of the earth, but how do we move into it? So I want to underline and acknowledge the difficulty of it all. And so the stuff that we've been talking about, the discussions that you've been having in your churches around the dinner table with each other, they're not easy to hear. They're difficult to integrate, to work through, to imagine a way forward. So part of me kind of wants at the beginning of this is just to push the pause button and just to kind of take a deep breath together and breathe into that and to say, yeah, this is rough. This is hard. And sometimes there's this notion that if the process were better organized, or if the resources were easier to access, if we had them earlier, if people weren't shouting so much in our culture, if Curate was better at talking about this stuff, and the fact is that the only way around this is through it, and that it is hard and messy work, and that what the bishop and the cabinet is calling us to is putting something in the center of our life together that we don't want to talk about. It's difficult. We have to contend with our history. They're saying we need to put this in the center. We need to contend with our history and our structure and our relationship and our culture as white folks. So it is complicated, and it will take time, and I think it will take a type of spiritual perseverance that is absolutely necessary. As a pastor, I'm really interested in the way that people change, and the whole difficulty towards moving towards change in any sustained way at all. And that's what my PhD was in, was really about a practical theology of sanctification, which is really just what's God doing when we end up changing, and what are the things that happen in our life to support that change. Because change is hard. I mean, heck, I don't have to look at too far in my own life to realize that sticking with a diet and exercise program is difficult to do. So when we're talking about change on the systemic level of racism, of untangling these strands, then we realize it's really difficult work. Because there's personal implications for us, especially when in the white church we have been organized in ways that are just not working culturally writ large, in the larger sense of that word. There are communal implications concerning how we've constructed our life together in terms of education, in terms of housing, in terms of access to jobs, in terms of material wealth, in terms of the justice system. There's political implications that want to divide this all up to left and right issues, that draw a line in the sand and say, okay, everybody kind of fall on one side or the other side of the line. And so we just kind of cut each other out. We don't know how to listen to each other very well. There's spiritual implications and pastoral implications of the work itself. The work itself out in our appointments and the way that we teach in our pastoral duties and our sermons, the way that we lead. And there are psychological implications that really put us all over the map Some of us have rolled up our sleeves and we're ready to dive in. We're ready to get after it. There's others of us that feel kind of resistant, don't understand why we have to be talking about this, or feel like that it's can be a form of racism itself to be talking about this. But and it triggers. I'm realizing the last few weeks within my own self and the community in Houston I'm working with, it triggers this kind of deep fight or flight dynamic. There's this concept in psychology that's called the backfire effect that suggests that we as humans, when we encounter evidence that challenges our belief, evidence that actually kind of proves that some stance that we are holding on to is flawed, it often ends up backfiring by causing the original stance to become even more strongly supported than before. In other words, in light of new data, in light of these new concepts, in light of seeing things in new ways, there is a tendency psychologically to double down on our original stance, to dig in, to kind of arm the battle stations. And so I say this just to acknowledge the natural resistance that we'll all have, that I have, that our churches will have, that you'll face not just within yourself and maybe even your families, but within your community, the resistance we're facing as a culture, as a denomination. And so there are forces within us that are just natural. There's forces outside of us that resist this process. It's forces that resist us looking at our history a little closer, looking at systemic racism and the genocidal cost that it's extracted and is extracting to the Black community. And so to come to grips with this, to acknowledge in some ways this new data, to take in this level of pain and suffering and stories, we must be led to it. I read some of Richard Rohr's stuff, and he says it's two things that will allow us to change, either pain or great love. And I've usually needed a combination of both of those things in my life to be open to new concepts. And but I do know that it's a grace to be led to it and to be carried to it. So amid all the concepts and the words, the history and the cacophony of cultural noise and some of the anger that we as a white community are experiencing or feeling, behind it all is the Black community that has been urging us to look, beckoning us to hear, urging, praying that we might bear witness to their stories. And this is one of the reasons why I think this is such spiritual work, that we have to cultivate compassion for ourselves and for others, because people are all along the spectrum of change. There are folks, like I said, that are rolling up their sleeves and jumped in. Others that are like, I don't even know how to begin. Others that are off the playing field and don't even want to begin to think about these things. And so it's going to take a long time and 1,000 points of light and a lot of perseverance. Listen to a podcast of Brene Brown this last week, her Unlocking Us podcast, where she suggests that shame is an energy that cannot produce change, that we can't get shamed into changing our thinking or behavior, which I think is so true. And that's why I think yelling and name calling feels quite counterproductive in this moment in our culture. Now, within the process of change, I think it's really appropriate to feel conviction over new information. And as we understand the racial disparities, the systemic divides that have burdened persons of color, when we let this in, when we begin to really see and take in these realities, conviction is a super appropriate response. And I think it begins to provide a pathway forward. Where shame locks me down, I want to talk about it, it really resists words. Conviction says, come on, there's liberty ahead. Now, this process that includes conviction really is a spiritual one. It's one that one of my friends is beginning to call the rhythms of resurrection, that experience conviction where the Holy Spirit begins to say, hey, things here need to change if you want to be free. And that conviction will always lead to a process of confession, where we kind of confess, oh, these things are happening. This is my side of the street. This is the way I've been complicit. This is the way that it's taken on shape, whether I have been conscious of that or not. It always takes us in through the neighborhood of lament, which always then will lead to forgiveness and a new way and form of living in the world. And this is the continual spiritual pattern that God uses to transform us. We're invited to into this pattern 1,000 times, sometimes 1,000 times a day, it seems like, an infinite amount of times. And this rhythm of resurrection is the pattern where old behaviors, loyalties, ideas die, and new ones are adopted, and new life is summoned. It's a process where we become unoffendable, right? So we can just, we don't have to be offended by stuff. We can take that in, we can begin to move through that process, and where we're open. Now, if we stay only in the conviction phase, if we don't move towards the confession, it becomes really toxic. And we'll begin to rely on coping mechanisms that foster and uphold systems of oppression. We'll find information often that supports our belief, and we kind of dig in, and we're back to the backfire effect, where we just kind of dig in and we kind of hold back anything that might be challenging to us. I think as a nation, as a church, we're in a conviction moment. And the Spirit of God has brought us here. We're not here because we're bad people. We're not here because folks want to take all our money. We're here because the Spirit of the living God wants to liberate us. And to hear the experiences of people, to be able to take it in, to know the history of our African American siblings, to look at our own white culture and the ways it has been constructed. This is really crucial work. Again, I want to acknowledge and continue just to underline that it is crucial and it is super difficult. In Harry Potter terminology, this is the dark arts, folks. I mean, this is the dark arts. This is the stuff that we have to look at, that we don't want to look at. This is what Carl Jung calls the shadows. And we have these massive shadows in our white culture. And this is just one of those shadows that we're called to enter into, to let the sunlight of God's Spirit be shown into that place, and to walk the path of fidelity and perseverance, and to stay in the tension, to hold the tension, and to let the Spirit of God continue to do the work that transforms us all. So as we step into this time together, I just want to open up a little time for some questions if people would have them, and we'll get at answering some of those, or at least attempting to.
Matt, we did have a few questions that came through. The first question, one of the first ones: can our conviction be contagious? This person struggles with other white friends who don't think this work is important, usually implicitly or not explicitly. Can our convictions be contagious?
Yeah, I mean, I would hope so. You know, I think that most of my own sense of transformation has been one that has been caught rather than taught, right? That I've been around folks, you know, Rachel and Mark are two of those folks in my life, among other people within this own area of my own coming to grips with white culture and privilege and those kind of aspects of power that have been super helpful. And so I think that the conviction can be taught. I think it also is taught as we live into our world in a different way, as we live into our lives in a different way too. And so Mark and Rachel, if y'all have anything to say, please feel free to hop in.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, it absolutely, I mean, it's so interesting with this kind of work because it is hard and painful at times, but I find what moves me the most is that, and what has helped move other people around me and draw me to people and help me find community when I felt discouraged or isolated and find other white people is when I glimpse and can imagine and see and feel more deeply human and see and glimpse what a world of healing and justice and flourishing really can be. And I witnessed that breaking in. I think that's what always, that picture, that vision is what will ultimately fuel us, that vision of beloved community. And the more we imagine it, the more we taste it and feel it and see it. And I see it in along with others, and it's infectious in that way. And that's what keeps me going on the hard days.
I talked to a person actually this morning that was in a community that I pastored a while back, and he called me today and just said, I'm struggling with all this discussion that's happening in all these churches about racism. And he said, he said, I need to talk to a white person that I trust that can hold this stuff for me and let me just kind of walk out some things without judging me. And I said, bring it, let's go, and I think that's some of that, what Paul talks about, working out our faith with fear and trembling, that we've got to have these pockets where there's deep trust that we can say what you need to say. I ain't going to judge you. Let's pick at it. Let's untangle the strands, as I was talking about. But we have to be able to enter into these discussions and not just assume that when I use the word systemic racism, that everybody gets it and we're all on the same page and nobody has a problem with that term, and so we have to work these things out. And I think the conviction is contagious, Rachel, like you were saying, in those moments of connection.
All right. One more question that did come in. I know we're trying to stick to our timeline here, Matt. And this may be one question that we can just kind of hold together as a group because it'll probably work its way into several of the topics that we're going to address today. Excuse me, that you're going to address. The question is, in the cycle or developing pattern from conviction to confession, lament to forgiveness, is there space for making amends? Is there space for restitution?
That is a great question, and I would say absolutely. I think that there is that's part of the creative work of the Spirit that leads us to that. I'm a person in long-term recovery, and so that idea of making amends is something that's kind of ingrained into the way that I have lived my spiritual life for about 25 years. And so as I look at this issue of systemic racism, yes, there is amend making. Now, I don't have a prescribed way of doing that. I think it has to be deeply creative. I think that there's a lot of different ways forward in that. There's not a one size fits all. This is what we do and now we're okay. But it really is about the amends making process is really about the restoration of relationship. It's about a new way forward. And so that's a long answer, just saying, yeah, there is.
All right, we encourage everyone to continue to send in your questions. We're going to move on. Rachel, I think you're up next, right?
Yep, thank you. And also, I just want to acknowledge I'm seeing some questions in the chat, just to give you all in the webinar a sense of what some of them are. Someone is asking, how do we pull politics out of this to focus with the focus on social justice? It seems to automatically move us to politics. Another person was asking about shame and how, how we work with shame and, start a conversation that with others that isn't immediately felt as accusatory and defensive. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, I don't think we're necessarily going to resolve this or answer it, but we are going to be continuing to kind of get into these questions of this difficult work of change. And it's not always difficult. Sometimes it's joyful, but unfortunately, this is hard stuff to hold and to engage with, in part because what we're actually trying to get a handle on is something that's been deeply harmful, deeply hurtful. There's no way to kind of surgically or spiritually get at it without some element of pain or discomfort. And that can be really heavy sometimes, which is why we really need community and we need spaces to be with one another in that. So I just want to remind us of where we came from, because I think we're now moving, below the layers. So one of the things we talked about last week was many of us have been taught to believe that to be racist is to be an intensely hateful or bad person. Maybe that's just kind of our intuitive understanding of racism. And so a suggestion that we might be racist or be part of a racist society or community can really trigger these intense feelings of guilt and shame. Like and also like this sense of like, why would I want to even continue to talk about racism or whiteness if I'm just going to feel bad, if I'm just going to be told that I'm a bad person? And often I think a misinterpretation of the current social movements is that they're anti-white people. And I think if we can just shift our imagination to realize that actually, no, this is an invitation for us as white people to live more fully into our humanity, because our whiteness does not define our humanity. In many ways, it has disconnected us from experiencing the fullness of human life, human community, and compassion and justice are part of that fullness of life. Mark talked about last week, all of us humans can participate in dehumanizing behaviors and ideas, but when we talk about racism, we're talking about more than just individual belief and behaviors or having racial bias or prejudices, though that can be part of it. What we're talking about and thinking about is how groups in our society operate in such a way that some are advantaged over others according to race. And this is called sometimes systemic or structural racism. So in this view, racism is not just a matter of the heart, though it involves matters of the heart. It's about culture, it's about habits, processes, where certain individuals and groups, white individuals and groups, come to be seen as good, desirable, normal, innocent, while others are seen as bad, undesirable, deviant, or criminal. It's a way of viewing the world that quite literally divides it into black and white. And the hard part for white people, I think, is that when it comes to racism, one can be a nice person, a really well-intentioned person, and still be part of racist systems or groups. We can have beliefs about human equality and still act in ways, and I do this all the time, still act in ways that cause harm or have a harmful impact. And when we're told about this impact, or when we're hearing cries on the street that are quite literally just speaking to this harmful impact, the challenge, I think, is to say, regardless of my intentions, I'm going to honor and hear this impact and make amends where I can. But oftentimes when we start to kind of take in the reality, we can feel so overwhelmed and so helpless. It can feel really discouraging. But we don't have to look very far around us to see that there are racial hierarchies around us, there are stereotypes, and that these have real death and life outcomes in terms of how people are treated, the opportunities they have access to, whether it's relating to police violence or COVID. And so over time, I've had to really learn that the continuation of racism does not depend on whether I have or do not have hatred or ill will or ill beliefs towards Black people or other people of color, or even whether I consciously hold beliefs about white people being superior. Rather, racism is just persisting in our society again and again because I and others, we all are part of this way of life, this way of life that is unsustainable to many, including, I would argue, ourselves, but a way of life that depends on and perpetuates the dehumanization of others and these deep inequities. So the work of confronting racism, it really involves facing the fact, facing the reality that so many people of color, past and present, have lost their lives, had their families destroyed, because, as Drew Hart, a Black theologian, writes, their lives were not deemed valuable enough to ensure their protection within a white-controlled society. And that's really hard to sit with. Knowing and wrestling with this history, learning it is never easy. I mentioned, I think in an earlier session or on a podcast, that my church and my own evangelical upbringing, it did not give me the spiritual or even the practical or psychological tools to reckon with this history. My church, my white Christian parents, they never talked about our country's history of racism and current racial inequities. They never encouraged me to wrestle with these things as a Christian. I learned, like many children, white children, to think of myself as innocent of racism, that it was somehow in the past. Growing up in a white, middle-class evangelical home, I was taught, I think like so many white people, to accept white group dominance as something that just kind of happened by nature, by accident, in the case of Christians, by God's divine blessing. And so this way of viewing the world, you know, that I just happened to have the life that I did and enjoy the benefits that I did, that it didn't have anything to do with the fact that there have been centuries of racial violence and terror, that white group dominance in some ways was bound up with the suffering of communities of color and Black communities. That was just an idea that I didn't encounter, you know, until well into, you know, my adult, well, I wouldn't say well into my adult years, but not really until I went to university, and I'm still kind of unpacking that reality. And I don't think I'm alone in this. So sadly, whether we want it to be the case or not, I think most of us are socialized into a culture of white supremacy. And what I mean by that is we are conditioned and taught to see the white American way of life as superior and good and benevolent. We never have to consider the harmful and destructive impact of this way of life on other people. And we're just kind of taught in subtle and overt ways that white culture is normative, that we're the best, and that we deserve to be at the top of the racial hierarchy. And, you know, of course, the problem with all of this is that it's always comes with a flip side. You know, while we're sort of considered what's, you know, the standard for what's good, normal, worthy, desirable, we're taught we don't really have to consider the views of others who are elsewhere on that racial hierarchy, because they're inferior or undesirable. And so one kind of obvious problem with all of this is that we lose the deep human richness and connection that comes from, one, diversity. We don't benefit from the wisdom and experience of people of color and communities of color and leaders of color. And that wisdom and experience is really needed when it comes to trying to get our hands around racism and understanding the impact of racism. But then, even more seriously, when other ways of thinking and behaving and deciding and leading and knowing are seen as inferior or deviant when compared to our own, it makes it easier as a society to treat their lives as expendable. So we have been taught quite literally to overvalue white life while undervaluing the lives of people of color. And this can lead to passivity when we see violence directed at people of color against their personhood. And it can also lead to like instinctive defense of white wrongdoing, which is not to say that like all aspects of white culture or our ways of life are wrong or bad. The real issue is when it's linked to dehumanizing and even violent attitudes and behaviors that really cause suffering for others. So some people will say, I guess many white people would deny that they hold any of these beliefs. So they would say like, I actually believe Black Lives Matter. And it may be true. I know it's true for me that I was taught this on a cognitive level, at least at a basic level in my church. But the problem is that we aren't always conscious of the many ways that we just swim in this water. We often act on instinct rather than what head knowledge we have. And one of the characteristics of whiteness is that it tends to deflect sustained attention. So again, we tend to see things as just the way they are, rather than something that needs to be changed. And so despite the continued evidence around us of deep suffering, deep inequity, the real costs of white supremacy, both to our humanity and the humanity of others, we continue to choose denial because in many ways it's easier than facing the really difficult truth. So this work is really, really hard and really, really painful and scary. And there's a way in which I'm going to just take a little bit longer, Todd, but I know we have to get to questions and answers. But there's a way in which I think because we want to maintain our kind of investment in our own churches and our communities and our families as good. We want to believe the best. We want to strive to be better, to do better. There's a natural avoidance and shielding of ourselves from discomfort, from the truths that we don't want to know. And when someone challenges us on that, it's so easy to react defensively, to want to protect ourselves. And we can do that in a lot of different ways, but we can retreat, we can react in fear, we can react in anger and contempt, we can be hyperactive in our guilt and our shame. So we want to desperately prove our goodness, and it becomes about focusing on our own goodness rather than really focusing on the suffering and the wrongs that need to be made right. And so that's where the idea of white fragility comes from. Robin DiAngelo talks about this. She's a sociologist. It's like the tendency of white people to avoid situations, to avoid them or to react offensively in situations where we feel racial stress. Those are her words. So when we have things that feel stressful to us, that go against the ways that we've been conditioned or challenged our ways of knowing, we respond with defensiveness, withdrawal, aggression, and there's so many ways that I could talk about. And if you want me to talk further about like how this shows up. But it's a problem because when we get caught up in our defensive reactions, which I have these as well, it prevents us from really taking responsibility for change, and it can then produce more behaviors that can be deeply destructive. And so the way to counter that fragility is really to build our capacity and our tolerance for this stress, to sit with the uncomfortable feelings, to recognize when we're feeling defensive, when we're tempted to respond in ways that cause harm to others, just to pause in that moment and learn how to work with it and through it to continue the work. Okay, I will take questions now, and just for a minute, and then I'll allow Mark, because I know we have more to get to.
Well, Rachel, there was just one that came in, and it was really more of an opinion, and it was, they really wanted more kind of an affirmation of their perspective. And their perspective is this: in order for one to really do the work of addressing the problems of racism, one must look into their whiteness and privilege first, and also the perspective of the Black population. And I think that goes to the point that you were making, is that until, it's you got to have both. It's one thing to be cognizant of an issue, but to understand the systemic racism and the systemic nature of the problem is difficult, but it's also very necessary, right?
Yes, and I would say too, sometimes I think we can, those of us who are more on the liberal side of things, who like to think of ourselves as liberal, I think something that can happen is we can sort of get all the right head knowledge, so we can learn all the right words, and this is where sometimes people are like, oh, this is becoming so academic, and people learn the right terms. It's not about whether you can use the term white fragility, you can define systemic racism. We all have the capacity and the ability to dig deeply into our own lives and into our own upbringings, into our own communities, and to reflect deeply. And not just that, I don't think you can just do that in isolation. So we have to do that, but our reckoning and our wrestling is always in relation to, the sort of felt and deep wisdom and also pain and perspective that comes from our Black siblings and our siblings of color. If it wasn't for those voices in my life, I'm not sure that I would have ever come to a different place. And you don't have to go out and find the first Black person or person of color, to all of a sudden it's not a right to have that engagement, but we have so many resources at our disposal to show us the full picture and to give us a sense of the full story.
Thank you, Rachel. Continue to ask your questions. Use the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen. And I know Mark is up next. And Mark, take it away.
Mark, you're muted.
Yeah, you're muted.
Thank you.
There you go.
Given the messiness and the difficulty of this type of work, as we've heard Matt discuss, and given the ideas of white fragility and all that term implies, as discussed by Rachel a moment ago, I think it may be helpful for white people to reframe the way we think about and approach the work of being an ally or learning how to better work for racial justice. And that's what I'll talk about in this section. We want to ultimately move from being confused or overwhelmed with how to be involved toward an idea of building up a resilient spirit, so that when things get hard or when it doesn't feel good, we can keep moving forward in the work. As Rachel discussed, one way that white supremacy has worked in our society is that it's often taught us to assume a certain innocence about white people or our intentions or our ways of being white. We've been trained to not see white racism and, in fact, assume a person of color is asking too much if something is challenged. When feeling challenged, it stings for sure, and it doesn't feel good to be associated with racism. That's something other people might do, but it can't be us. I remember a story when I was at a church, one of the first churches I worked at some 15, 16 years ago. And there was a deacon, and we were having a meeting one night about how we might engage in a community, a Hispanic immigrant community that was nearby. This was in Eastern North Carolina. And I'll never forget the deacon spoke up and he said, I'll tell you what, he said, in my opinion, he said, the blacks need to worship with the blacks. That was his language, not mine. The Mexicans need to worship with the Mexicans, and we don't need to be together. Which was shocking to me, at the time when he said that. He said it so explicitly and so out there that I responded with all of the zeal of a 21-year-old or so, and I said, that's racism. And I'll never forget, he looked right at me. This was a small Baptist church. He looked right back at me and he said, are you saying I'm racist? And I said, well, yeah, like what you just said, that is like that's an easy one. That's a pretty textbook definition of a more explicit form of that. I tell that story just to say that even here in what would seem like a very clear-cut, explicit or vulgar expression, verbal expression of racism, even this deacon, recoiled at the idea of being associated with the idea of being racist. And that was very difficult for him because, again, like of that sort of implicit, assumed innocence of his view and the normality of his view, which, again, that's a more egregious expression of that. But nevertheless, it shows too that if demands are made on us, or when people point out injustices or biases in ourselves or in the ways our systems are structured, it comes across as an affront and can make us question our goodness and our innocence. I think it's true that across cultures and groups, it rarely feels good at first to hear that, or to hear that something privileges us, or ways that we tend to think and act may be harmful to others, or play a role in some sort of larger systemic form of dominance or oppression. Of course, that doesn't feel good. But as Christian folks, though, it shouldn't come as a surprise that sin, and we can certainly call white supremacy a sin. I know that's not easy for everyone to hear, but we could call it that. But to know that sin is present in our world and in our lives, that shouldn't, for Christian folks, that shouldn't be a surprise. That's sort of a textbook definition of how we understand sin. So with that in mind, we confess sin and acknowledge our need for grace and sanctification, often in our church services. That's a pretty normal part of the way many of us approach Christianity. And so it begs the question of why then it can be so hard for us to acknowledge this particular form of sin, that of white racism or white supremacy. And I think that's because of how much we've been taught over the centuries that, as we've already heard, whiteness somehow sort of equals goodness or purity and sanctity. Of course, we're being good and rational. It's the other side who needs to see things from our perspective, we might say. So when we're genuinely trying to learn and hold space for what we're hearing from others, and it becomes hard or difficult or exhausting, it can be easy to just give up and walk away from the emotional and relational work that needs to be done. And we need to wrestle and sit with this question of how do we push forward? How do we build up resilience? And I've gotten a few points. I have a few points now for us to think about. One place to start following Robin DiAngelo is to consider what it would mean to stop investing in the idea that we as white people have to be good and to be in control, that we have to be, live into this space of innocence. It might be okay to say, yes, these are the systems that have been built up over the years, and they do favor white people. And yes, I may discover some unconscious or conscious biases about people of color within myself. But just as Christians are taught to accept God's transformative grace for the damaged parts of our being, the estrangement and the ways we miss the mark, white Christians can also acknowledge our need for God's grace to stay on this process of sanctification, this transformative journey, to say that we don't have it all together and that we do need grace to work on that, not just for forgiveness, but for that larger transformative and process and the restitution processes that we've already began to talk about. Another way to ask this is, what does it mean to shift from the often unconscious idea that we have to be morally perfect somehow? In other words, that, there's no way that I participate in these structures or privileges. And instead, other theological questions that we might ask are, how can I listen to what the Spirit is doing in our day and age? what does it mean for me to faithfully respond and follow Christ into these conversations? Again, it's not this intense sort of feeling of how do I be right, but how can I respond faithfully? How can I stop and see what's going on, what God's Spirit is doing? It's about being open to new movements, new opportunities that God's Spirit is opening up to us. To do this, though, like any other difficult thing we attempt to do, we have to build capacity for complexity and ambiguity, building capacity for resilience. We so often want things to be in neat categories or binaries. We either want things to be good or bad, innocent or guilty, pure or contaminated. We want good guys and bad guys, so to speak, such that it hurts if we think we're being associated with the bad guys. As we know with so many other aspects of our lives, though, this purity or neat compartmentalization just doesn't work for most parts of our lives, and especially for issues regarding race in our country and in our lives. We'll inevitably feel some sort of guilt or shame, or even more, some reflexivity and a desire to shield ourselves from accusations or claims directed toward white culture or white supremacy, as Rachel's discussed. But anything worth doing will often mean working through that wealth of feelings that we feel and the reactions. And the challenge is, again, to build up the resiliency, to keep working through all of this when it feels overwhelming. There's a saying I've started to see in recent years, and it's touched me and it's stayed with me. And it says, if you get tired, learn to rest, not quit. Again, that's if you get tired, learn to rest, not quit. While there's very much a strong sense of urgency for us to do what we can to make conditions in our society better, and to do that right now, and we should follow that sense of urgency, we also have to know that due to the deeply entrenched nature of what we're up against, that these changes are not going to happen overnight. And that's not some sort of pass for taking a very gradualistic approach, but it is to say, it's to give a realistic assessment of the deeply entrenched nature of what we're up against here. So in other words, it's not a question of if we'll feel feelings of guilt or shame, or if we'll get tired or overwhelmed by the work at times. It's a matter of when we will. And when that comes, we should consider what it means to build up our capacity to be resilient, to think what it means to rest, to not rest in terms of walking away and not coming back, but just to rest, to regain our sense of equilibrium and to regain a renewed sense of energy for this work and to keep doing it, so that we can continue to do this difficult work. Again, resting is not quitting. The second aspect, these are a little shorter. Another framing aspect that can make this work hard is precisely the sense that we, as white people, we expect that we can solve every problem and seek immediate or quick results. That's especially tempting for pastors, I'm sure. It is for me in my work with the nonprofit that I direct. But we won't always see results. And this is a type of work that can be both necessary and also not make us feel warm and fuzzy. And of course, we as humans would tend to gravitate toward the work that can make us feel better about ourselves, and we can see good, clear, neat, easy results. It's like, though, I would liken it to this. It's like the necessity of having honest and earnest conversations with our loved ones or with our children when there's a difficult thing we need to address in a relationship. It's not fun work or work that feels good in the process, but those hard conversations, we know with age and experience that they're still necessary. Not every aspect of parenting or pastoring or being a romantic partner feels good, but that difficult work is still needed so that we can move from a place of toxicity to a healthier space. The third aspect is this desire to feel good is part of the assumption is that we can be the ones to fix everything. There's a tension in our present moment, I think, between people of color asking white people to not assume we can do things for them, which is right in a patriarchal or colonial way, or in a way that we are not the saviors and we don't position ourselves in that way. And yet also that white people need to do something to address white supremacy and how it impacts us and how we participate in it. In our history, white Christians have often said out loud that we in white America are indeed a saving power in the world. We have at times, going back especially in the 19th century and parts of the 20th, we have at times told inaccurate and harmful stories of how we've saved indigenous people or African people or other peoples through colonization around the world, spreading democracy, so to speak. We may not argue such things in the same way today, but it does seem to be the case that we don't know quite what to do with ourselves when a big problem like this is before us and we're not in the position to be that savior figure, or if it's a problem that requires us to really dig in for the long haul. That's hard, it's hard work. And the last thing briefly is idea of what to do when we're in positions of power or leadership as white people, there is, of course, a tension between the need to address racial inequities and how people of color have often been excluded from higher positions of power and leadership in our church structures and in social structures. That can at times make white people in higher positions of power or public-facing, roles. It can make us feel that maybe we need to back away, or maybe we need to stay on the wall and not engage as much. And this is a tricky issue, but while institutions and boards and faculties and other organizations, while they do need to consider ways to work towards this now and in the future, it's also the case that if white people find themselves in these types of leadership positions, that we do use our privilege and our influence to work on doing the right thing and in trying to find ways that we can address the issues before us. My former doctoral advisor, and who's a Black liberation theologian and professor, he once said to me and a few other white folks, he said, look, we need people in the head of the beast to help people who are being swallowed up by the beast. And he said that as a way to say, walking away or relinquishing our influence can inadvertently create space for things to go backwards or to get worse, which is something we should continue to consider, all while we continue to strive earnestly toward greater levels of inclusion and diversity. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mark. One of the questions that came in it was asked last week and it was asked again this week. And I'll just kind of use this as a question to kind of cue up Matt. I think Matt is up next, but the question is really when you see something that is wrong, I'm reminded of John Lewis and his desire to speak up when he saw something wrong. What do we do when we see our fellow clergy people or someone doing something wrong? How do we hold them accountable?
I think about it in a couple of ways. One, on an institutional level, I would say, look at what the structures and policies are that are in place for your district, speaking in a Methodist conference, and with people in leadership positions there. I think on a more personal level, it's always a great thing to do to start by getting some clarification, assuming that maybe not assuming the worst about someone until you check into it and really get a better sense of the situation. This is the time when accusations can be serious and can be damaging. So actually making sure that you're clear on what's happening. That's good. Sometimes it might be very clear, but other times it might be a misunderstanding or miscommunication. So it's always good to check into that and to always balance, and there is no easy formula to do this, but to always try to find ways to balance justice and mercy, I think, as God does, and find ways to constructively address issues. Again, I can't speak for particular Methodist context, but I think to see grace and justice as being balanced somehow, and also not to let a sense of allegiance or loyalty to our fellow clergy to let that somehow inadvertently lead us to silence the voices of those who may have been harmed in a legitimate way.
Thank you, Mark. Matt, I know you're up next. Take it away.
Yeah. One of the things I would just say, and to add on to that, Mark, would be that sometimes within our system, within the Methodist structure, there is kind of this built-in competition that's based on kind of size of churches and where we're going to find our next appointment and all those kind of things. And so some of the things that I've realized that are really toxic to the spiritual life seem to be competition, categorization, and judgment. And when that gets baked into kind of a process and an institution, then it's really hard to then kind of do this biblical thing, which is to go to our brother or sister and have these kind of discussions based on this kind of mutual sense of how do we call each other on. because we're seeing each other within our own system as people that we're in competition with, or somebody that we have to somehow. So we've got all these layers, even in our Methodist system, that kind of keep us from having these conversations, that keep us from looking at that. And I think it's something we just need to acknowledge and work through and keep asking about. But we do have to have these conversations within relationships with each other, and we have to figure out how to, like you had said, Mark, how to suck the judgment out of it, so that we can get at the root of what's happening, right? And so, yeah.
I would just raise my hand. I would just add to that so I'm part of an activist called Showing Up for Racial Justice, and it is focused on educating and mobilizing white people, because we very much believe that that there is work that really has to be done with each other. So in this kind of moment where there's so much talk about cancel culture and calling people out, and we've already talked about kind of how shame can sort of be toxic sometimes in how we both respond when we feel shamed, but also, how we can it's, I think, so easy sometimes, I know, especially people who like to think of themselves as good, white, liberal, or progressive people, I think so often like just to point out the racism out there and talk about their uncle or their cousin or whatever, rather than grappling with their own lives. So I think there's a humility that comes with holding ourselves accountable first. And being willing and demonstrating that we're willing to be held accountable and really modeling that. It makes it easier to hold others. But also we talk about calling in rather than calling out. How do we call people in a way that recognizes that just as we have had a journey of growth and understanding, that when we get that hard conversation, seeing it as a gift and a way to deepen our own journeys, and seeing that as a way that we can deepen others. But when you have competition with people, or you're not really seeing that yourself as an equal with them or as a co-journeyer with them, it makes it hard to have a culture of calling in.
Yeah. I think also would say that there's no place for racism within the United Methodist Church. And if there are folks that are established in that kind of viewpoint, that really then becomes, we have systems and structures and an episcopacy that stands against that kind of nefarious action. We have resolutions, we have our social principles. I mean, we're stacked with this stuff to realize that this in this day and age cannot continue. And so, and this next section, as we kind of shift, if that's okay, I really want to enter into a bit of a conversation, Mark, with you and Rachel, and because we've talked about, and some of these, we've kind of done a data dump in the last couple of webinars, in a sense of kind of putting a lot of information in the room, and trying to define these words like racism and systemic racism and these kind of structural issues. And so all of these things are kind of in the room. And a part of that resiliency, Mark, that you talked about is also rooted in how our imagination shifts from being held by these issues of power and whiteness and supremacy to one that is rooted more, what I would think, much more in a biblical text that call us to a different future together. It seems like this is part of Jesus' genius in how he engaged folks in their imagination through parables, through the way that he prayed, through his social location, not just what he said, but where his feet were, kind of where he showed up and who he was in relationship with was like super important. I think I mentioned earlier this gentleman I talked to this morning who is really struggling and feeling very uncomfortable about all this discussion about race in the church. And I realized too, after I said that, he hadn't bolted, he's sticking with it. He's not in a sense saying, man, I'm out of here. I'm taking my toys and I'm going to go somewhere. He's trying to stay in the tension. And so as we talk about this new imagination, number one, I guess I'd ask, why is this concept of our imagination so important? You know, I hear Walter Brueggemann talk about this concept. I hear this talk about the social imagination. I mean, it could sound like it's Disney, kind of like a Disney film, or at worst academic speak, you know? And so why the shift of our imagination is so important?
I'll say quickly, I'll point back to a proverb where there is no vision, the people will perish. And where if we replace the word vision with imagination, or if our imaginations are only structured to see the world in one particular way, then so many other opportunities can be lost and left out inadvertently. And working in Lake Providence, Louisiana, has been tremendously rewarding and also tremendously difficult, because there can be times when you know, we don't know what we don't know, and we don't if we haven't experienced something, then we just don't have an experience or a category or a compartment for those types of things. And one great gift can be sometimes, one great gift obviously is starting with learning and listening, but also saying, well, what about, or how about if we tried, you know, a lot can be unlocked. I grew up, that's my own story. I don't project that onto Lake Providence or the Delta. I grew up in a first generation college student. I grew up in a small rural town, and I know what that experience was like, to only know one particular thing, and to only be able to see the world in one particular way. And I'm grateful for places where those little fissures or cracks in my imagination occurred, largely through relationships, so that I could begin to see things in a slightly different way. But it is important.
I mean, I'm curious to you all in the webinar. I mean, what have been the moments that have been really transformative for you in your journeys of race and like seeing things differently? I mean, if you want to drop them in the chat, please do. But, you know, for me, the most powerful moments and times, you know, again, I guess I believe this so strongly. It's not something I learned in a book. It's something that I found in my own life, that it wasn't the guilt or the shame, you know, or getting knowledge that really changed me, that added, but really it was these moments where I glimpsed another world or another way of being, you know. And I think that that's so, but not, you know, we have these resources in the Christian tradition, this idea that like faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not yet see. This idea that there is this coming moment that's here and not yet, this taste of beloved community, you know, that can really, I think, that is actually something that I don't know if others have as rich resources to really keep them, that they can draw on that. But that idea that like we're working for something that we haven't yet fully seen, you know, but we're striving after that, because when we look back, I mean, what do we return to? We don't have a picture of, you know, what's the past that we're, you know, we can return to, you know. It's all of this work is living into faith, really, and sort of our deepest convictions about how our world was created to be. And yeah, I'm seeing things like travel, that's been really important for me, cross-cultural engagements, seeing how other, you know, communities have tackled racism, how there's been progress. Exactly, this way that oftentimes I think it's travel. For me, it was going to South Africa the first time and really being able to see how racism worked in another context sort of gave me a whole new mirror for my own context.
Yeah, that's great. You know, I think that I would just say this too, that I think my imagination was changed in encounters with other people. I remember being at a vigil, it was 4 or 5 years ago now, when Alton Sterling and Philando Castillo were were killed by police officers, and then the whole thing up in Dallas kind of exploded, and we had a vigil at our church, and some African American folks came and like led the vigil, and they were sharing stories in first-person narratives of some of the lives of folks that had died. And I felt, that is crazy. I'm not like one of those people that would say, God told me this, you know. But I felt like the Holy Spirit kind of, and I was getting like angry in the midst of this vigil, because I was like, you know, why don't they talk about the white, you know, cops that were killed, you know? And I felt like the Holy Spirit kind of say to me, how does it feel not to own and to be able to control the narrative right now? And I realized that as a white pastor, everywhere I'd ever been, I'd been able to frame what we were going to say, in a sense, kind of control that, and then rebuttal anything that I didn't like to see happen in the midst of that. And here was something that I was like, and it broke through, one of those fissures that you're talking about, Mark. It kind of broke through to me, and I was like, oh, these folks have a whole history that I haven't had to look at, haven't needed to look at, have been able to stay away from. And that began to kind of open me up in a way that was deeply disorienting, you know? Yeah. So what does this practical imagination look like, this new imagination look like in practical terms for y'all? If we're putting boots on the ground and not just talking stuff, like what's it look like? How does that work itself out?
I mean, part of it, you know, there's this way I'm curious what Mark's thoughts on this is, and yours, Matt, too. But part of it for me has been really intentional choices that I've made that have been very slow. It's been a struggle. Sometimes I don't know the full implication of the decisions until after, and all my fragility stuff gets kicked up. But it's been intentional choices to reorient my life. And I think we can all do this even in our communities, in our churches, but where we stand shapes our imagination, shapes our perspective. So where I live, where I've chosen to live, is important. Who I've chosen to study under is important. What books and like what Christian leaders I choose to listen to, what media I consume is important, because all of this is shaping our imagination one way or another, whether it's a white, racist, supremacist imagination, or whether it's a faithful, Christian, human imagination, whatever term you want to use. And so for me, it gets down to the real practical kind of stuff of my daily life. And of course, when I do that, it exposes, Mark, you told me once, you quoted Malcolm X, I think it was Malcolm X, scratch a liberal, find a racist. Yeah. And, I think that's real, right? Like there's a way in which as I work out this practical stuff and I move outside of my white comfort zone and have relationships that can challenge me. And it's not always about forming those relationships, but I think it's part of it. Though, I discover kind of my stuff that I didn't even know was there, and it's a new opportunity.
Yeah. I was really, no, go ahead, Mark, please.
I was going to say, I'd echo a lot of that. And I'm just reflecting, when you asked the question, I went on a spiral back through the years. Things. Definitely, I've had the privilege through various moves in my life, physical moves in terms of going to school or for work or jobs, and questions of where I would choose to live. I'd say for the last 11 or 12 years of my life, I've lived in places where I'm in the minority racially, and not in like the hipster gentrifying kind of way. That can always be construed different ways, but I say that that was not me going into a community to be a savior or anything like that. It was an intentional decision to try to learn and to be exposed to what it's like to not be in predominantly white spaces all the time, which is definitely easy for white people in certain regions and parts of the country to be in that space. The other things Rachel mentioned too, like who I read, what I listen to, who I've studied with, friendships that have been made. The story I wanted to share briefly, the thing that was transformative for me was when I was 16 years old, I was working at a little grocery store as a part-time job while I was in high school. And there was a Black bivocational pastor who also worked at the grocery store, who was probably in his late 40s or so at the time I was 16. And he would always invite everybody to come to his church, his little Baptist church, for revival services that they had all the time. And I don't know what in the world led me to do it, but one night he had invited us, and I'd become friends with this gentleman, and I took him up on his offer, and I went, and the experience, I was 16 years old. I'd never been in a predominantly Black church before, ever, nor had I experienced a racially integrated congregation before either. And yeah, there was something transformative about that experience. And that's not a formula I can concoct and give for other people. And it might hit people differently in different ways, depending on where they are in life. But it was a sacred experience. And it was something that began at least over those years when that deacon made the comment that he made later, as I shared at the beginning of this. That was 3 or 4 years afterwards. And for goodness sake, I don't know that my imagination would have been in a place where I would have said what, or responded, or if that would have even registered with me in a certain way what he said. It may have registered wrong, but because I'd had 4 or 5 years of a relationship of worshiping regularly with this Black congregation, because of the friendship I had with this pastor, who knows what my life would look like or where I would be right now. So it's lots of things, and it's no one single thing. It's lots of things.
That's good. That's good. So what opportunities does living into, as we're thinking about like an anti-racist future, like imagining a new future, really thinking about that in terms of practical terms and the shifts of these kinds of relationships, what opportunities does living into an anti-racist future offer us?
I'll jump back in on that one. I think one of the most important ones is that it offers up the opportunity for our Black colleagues, sisters, brothers, and people of color to breathe more deeply and to have life and to have it more to the fullest, which I think is what should always undergird these discussions and this effort. I saw a question earlier about what do we do when this gets pulled into politics, or politics get pulled into this. Which I would say, I always make a distinction between politics per se and partisan, making something partisan a partisan issue, like, oh, this is a Republican or a Democrat thing. At the root of all of this, as Christian folks, our theology constantly points us back to the basic integrity of human life that we all share in. And so there's an opportunity there. And I think that there's another side of this for white folks, and I'll say this for myself. There's, as scary as some of this feels and as hard as some of this feels, I think there's actually on the other side of all of this, whatever that looks like and however long it takes to get there, I think there's also an opportunity for white people to breathe more deeply too, and to breathe more easily, because what a weight it is to constantly live in this sort of way that we've talked about, that's just not easy for it's as normal to us as the water we swim in. If we were fish, like, that's just what we know. But I do think there are some glimmer and glimpses of a better and more genuine and more human and authentic way for us to live if we take this journey to work through these things.
Yeah. Actually, I just had that image of the water that we swim in is toxic. It's polluted water, and the water that we're being led to is that kind of water that Jesus talks about, that living water. you know. And so it's the water we know, and we think this is as good as it's going to get. But as we go through this difficult, hard time of really working through these things, and that kind of equity where our brothers and sisters all over can breathe easier, you know, then we all breathe easier. I mean, this is Jesus stuff, man, you know, and this is about the transfer. This is why I'm a Methodist, y'all. Mark, we need to convert you over, because this is what we do as Methodists, you know. This is the call that we have. So
I've got just the place for you. I can make that really.
Come on, Bishop.
Let's talk. The other thing I wanted to say, because if I don't say it, I'll forget it. And well, something that has stuck with me, a professor, Rachel knows as well, Jim Perkinson up in Detroit, has said, you know, his work. And
That's great.
he has said in a class, maybe he's written it, I don't know where I got this, but it came from him. And he said, you know, he was telling a group of white people, he said, there's more than one way to be white, right? Like whiteness is not, our racial identities are not things that we can just slough off if we get tired of wearing them. Like, that's part of who we are, but there's more than one way to live into the whiteness and into the privilege that we have, which was an incredibly freeing thing for me to hear, of like, yes, I'm white, and my embodiment of that will look certain ways and accrue certain privileges and things like that. But there's still a sense of agency of what do I do with that whiteness, and how do I embody it, and how do I live into it. We're not locked into one single thing forever and ever, all eternity. So there are better ways to do it.
Thank you. Todd, should we kind of lead back into a more general discussion, or are there questions that folks that want to ask or that y'all have?
Yeah, we've gotten a lot of questions that you've answered them live, actually. So that's been going great, and we've got some great chat going. People reflecting on when they had those transformative moments. So it's been great. So just continue the conversation as you wish.
Rachel, you had mentioned Be the Bridge as one of the resources that I want to just kind of highlight within that that chat, which I found also, you know, as a person that continues to grow in this work and understanding, to be really helpful too. And so I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but I found that to be very helpful. Or was that you? No, that was Lori. Okay.
Yeah,
sorry.
but other people have been mentioning it, but I echoed it. I have, you know, personally, I've heard many really good things about Be the Bridge. It's a national kind of organization that really, you know, it seeks to expand imagination and really do this deep work interracially, but really by centering the voices and experiences of people of color. So if that's like something, you know, they work with a small group model, they put out excellent resources. I would really, you know, recommend that. I personally haven't gone through it, but I know many people who have, and it's been really powerful for them. So, you know, there's so many resources out there right now, you know, so it's really about digging in, taking that next step. You can't solve it all overnight, but you can figure out how to discern to take that next step. And, you know, I think there's always this challenge, right? Because the work of transformation on a personal level is we know often occurs through these many micro moments. Yeah. And so whenever we get to the end of these conversations, I always find, especially if it's in a mixed racial group, you know, there's both the kind of realities, and also, you know, from those of you who are clergy, you know that this work is, the work of change can be very slow in our own lives of transformation. And then we have this sense too of like, we can't wait, we can't breathe, you know, this is too late, this is centuries too late, and this change has to happen now. And that prophetic call, how we hold those things, they're not even, they're just, they both are. And I think as you, Mark, Matt, as all of us have talked about this, we've kind of just been left holding that. And I'm sure all of you will feel that too. But that doesn't mean that we should, even if it is slow and messy, that we should stop struggling and striving and pushing, you know, even wherever we see that opportunity, even if it's seems like a small opening to take that opportunity when we see it, to make life a little bit better for our siblings of color, for our Black siblings, to make life a little bit better for our own children, so they don't carry the burden of this culture, this toxic culture of white supremacy. You know, this is why we do that work.
Amen.
All of you have mentioned resources, and there's been some great chat on resources. I just wanted to remind everyone that on our website, la-umc.org/endracism, for each module, we have a list of resources, everything from podcasts to books, and they're also specific to each module. So if you would like to explore anything a little bit more in depth, please check out our website. Matt, are we ready to?
I think we're ready to wrap up unless there's
Okay.
other questions.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions. The chat's been going great. So this has been time well spent. Thank you very much. Bishop Harvey is going to have a closing word and will end us in prayer. Bishop Harvey, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all again. I've been trying to follow the chat and the questions, and oh my gosh, they're rich, rich questions, and even the exchange between some of you in the chat also really, really helpful. This is exactly what I envisioned when we began these conversations, and conversations with really Matt originally, about how these we love Project Curate, but they can't be with us forever, right? So how is it that you all are going to begin to embed this into your daily bread? How do you keep these conversations going amongst yourselves in the conference and within your churches as well? I think that's going to be really, really important as we move forward. We're working right now to figure out how we create spaces for you to have these conversations, much like you just had in the chat and in the Q&A, that you have these amongst yourselves as well. So the fact that we can't all gather somewhere at the Wesley Center, which is our big conference center, it's kind of like Lakeview, Matt, but it's a prettier site. Lakeview is the conference center in the conference. Not to diminish that, it's a beautiful place too, but we want to be able to figure out how we can keep you in conversation with one another. That's the whole intent of this. And so for Mark and Matt and Rachel to just kind of spark in you a thought or something you want to know more, you now have seen your friends and your colleagues that have posted in the chat. Pick up the phone, email them, make those connections yourselves. That's another step in this direction. So I'm grateful to Mark and Matt and Rachel for continuing to have these conversations with us. We have more to come, and we're going to keep engaging and keep pulling and keep pushing and keep prodding. I have said that I'm not going to stop talking about this. It's hard, and you know, the email is interesting that I get about the conversations that we are having, but I am happy to engage in those conversations. I know we have that site for resources on our website, but also on umc.org, and if you go there, there's the whole effort by the United Methodist Church to end racism. That is a united, no pun intended, a united effort toward the end of racism. We've said before that a lot of people are dealing with this injustice, and we have the unique lens of bringing our theological and our ecclesiological lens to this. Matt referred to, we ought to only see these things through the eyes of Jesus. So that is our unique opportunity that no one else has. And as United Methodists, this is part of we've got lots of sins to confess for in our past about racism. But really, if you go back into our book of resolutions. There's just a lot that we have. In fact, little strides probably. They're not great yet, but some strides that we're making toward ending racism. And we name that racism is antithetical to the gospel. That is in everything that we say and everything that we are. So just invite you to go there as well. I'm going to be speaking to that as the president of the council. That's also another place where my energy is going toward ending racism and a real focus toward anti-racism. So I give thanks again that you've given your hour and a half to this. And you've got a lot of other things to do, but you've recognized, those of you that are on this call, you've recognized that this is important conversation and even grappling with your own self, because I do that every day on this very topic of how is it that we can actually have a conversation with one another. Someone just prompted me at 5 o'clock today. I'm on another podcast with the United Methodist Women on this very issue. So I know, I think it's on our website as well. It's certainly on my Facebook page, but it's a similar conversation. It will be with Susan Henry Crow of General Board of Church and Society, Aaron Hawkins of the General Commission on Religion and Race, and United Methodist Woman, myself, and Harriet Olson. So UMW. So it's another place, another platform to continue to grow into this conversation. That's a conversation mostly with women. So that's the audience. So it's just another perspective, if you will. So I just invite you to keep talking, keep struggling, keep trying to find the words. You're not going to have the perfect words. I know that I will make many mistakes along the way in the words that I use or the words I don't use. But I will say that being silent and not using words is not an option. I would rather apologize to you for saying something that's a misstep or something wrong than not saying anything at all. Okay. So Matt, did you have something else?
Yeah, I just wanted to remind folks that next week we'll be talking about Blackness and anti-Blackness, and two of our colleagues will be on the webinar, Brandy Holmes and Cleve Tinsley, and they're just amazing folks that y'all will love and get a lot out of. But just brilliant, and they've been doing this work in the communities for decades now, and so it'll be just a pleasure to be able to share these folks with y'all. They're wonderful and part of a rich community that we're involved in. And Bishop, thank you for this time. Thank you for your work that you're doing, for the way that you're leading this in our denomination. It's an honor.
Thank you
to be here with you.
Thank you. So let's pray. Gracious God, here we are again. But we know you're still here because you've never left us. So we hold on to that promise that you've made to us, that you will never leave us or forsake us. You also remind us in Scripture that nothing can separate us from your great love. And again, we hold on to that piece of hope, that piece of promise, that piece of encouragement, that no matter what we say and what we don't say and what we do, that you promise to not let anything get in the way of your love for each of us. So continue to remind us that we are your children, that we are all children of God, that we are yours, that you've called us by name, you've redeemed us, you know us, and you love us anyway. So for all of that, we give thanks for Rachel and for Mark and for Matt. I especially thank you, and for the courage that each of the persons gathered on this call have to even just join into this conversation and continue to struggle and grapple and be honest with themselves and with one another. This is, in fact, hard work, but it is courageous and important work. So I give thanks. And I give thanks to you, oh God, for journeying with us every step of the way. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Bishop Harvey. Thanks to everyone who joined us today. We will see you back here, same place and same bat channel, as they say, Thursday at 2 p.m. for module number 3. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great week.